Before dawn, you hear the scrape of a quill on vellum, cold stone underfoot, candle smoke in the throat. A monk has psalms to remember, scripture to copy, and no room for error. Beside the desk sits a small bundle of silver-green sage, sometimes rosemary too, breathed in, steeped warm, taken before hours of reading. No capsules, no stimulant ritual, no modern productivity system, just a garden plant, a cup of warmth, and discipline against fatigue. So how did a herb once tied to wisdom become stuffing and sausage? The answer begins outside the scriptorium, in the one place every serious monastery protected like an archive, the garden. I am not following a legend here. I am following a trail. It runs through monastery plans, herbals, medical notes, and the careful language of people who did not separate prayer, work, memory, and the body as sharply as we do now. And that matters, because the old claim was never that sage was a miracle cure. It was more restrained than that, more serious. Sage carried a reputation for steadiness, clear thought, and troubles of the head. The common story says monks preserved books. That is true, but too small. They also preserved routines, gardens, recipes, ways of staying attentive when the work demanded hours of exact memory. So the question is not whether medieval people were naive. The question is why their practical system was later flattened into flavor. To understand why a monk trusted the leaf, we first have to understand what a monastery garden really was. Walk through a monastery gate in the early Middle Ages, and the garden is not decoration. It is infrastructure. You would see raised beds, laid out with purpose, not romance. Plants labeled so a brother could find them quickly. Paths close enough to the infirmary that the sick, the elderly, a pilgrim, or a poor traveler could be reached without delay. Nearby, there were drying racks, jars, mortars, and work tables. Leaves were cut, sorted, dried, crushed, and stored. This was a working pharmacy before it was ever a museum. And the reason it worked was not mystery. It was organization. The Carolingian world, especially under Charlemagne, cared about ordered estates and useful plants. Lists tied to estate and monastic cultivation named herbs that belonged inside managed care, and sage was part of that practical world. Not as folklore floating in the air, as a plant placed in a system. Then, in the 9th century, Walafrid Strabo wrote the Hortulus, a poem about his small monastery garden. What makes it remarkable is how he treats plants. They are useful, yes, but also moral and spiritual companions. Things to tend, study, remember. So monasteries became engines of preservation because they had the rare combination: literacy, land, infirmaries, and routine. No marketing, no laboratories. Just beds, books, hands, and time. And among those beds, one plant carried a name so ambitious it sounded almost like a claim of rescue. That plant was sage, common sage, Salvia officinalis. Even the name carried weight. Salvia was tied in Latin tradition to ideas of saving, healing, being made whole. So when a monk bent over that gray-green plant, he was not just looking at seasoning. He was looking at a small, tough thing with a name that sounded like rescue. And you can understand why it earned that place. Run the leaf between your fingers, and it does not behave like a soft garden herb. It feels textured, almost dusty. It gives off a resinous scent, sharp and warm at the same time. On the tongue it is bitter, not sweet, not flattering. Bitter in the old medicinal sense, the way a plant announces that it was meant to be taken seriously. It dried easily. It held its strength. It survived rough seasons. That mattered. Medieval medicine trusted plants that could be gathered, stored, and used when the body or mind seemed unsteady. And sage gathered a reputation large enough to produce the famous saying linked with Salerno, "Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden?" The exact attribution varies. The message does not. This herb was not minor. Here is where the overlap becomes powerful. Sage was a plant for care. Sage was also a word that evoked the wise person. Medicine and memory met in the same sound. A leaf, a name, an idea of steadiness. But the monks did not explain its power with neurotransmitters. They explained it with a map of the body modern people no longer use. To understand the monk's map, forget the brain scan for a moment. Medieval medicine pictured the body as a balance of qualities, warm and cold, dry and moist. Too much of one quality could push a person out of order. Heavy limbs, thick breath, cloudy thinking, a dull head after food or sleep, all of it could be read through that simple grid. So an herb was not just good or bad. It had a temperament. Sage was read as warming and drying. That made sense to them because the plant announced itself that way. It was aromatic. It was bitter. It cut through the air when crushed. In that worldview, those traits mattered. A warm, dry herb belonged against dampness, phlegm, heaviness, and the kind of mental fog they believed came with it. Modern medicine does not use that map, but dismissing it too quickly misses the real story. Because the practice around the herb did something obvious. You picked it, you bruised the leaf, you smelled the sharp oil on your fingers. You made a warm infusion and waited. The scent woke the senses. The heat slowed the body. The preparation created a pause. That was not neuroscience, but it was a working ritual. And sage was not alone. Rosemary stood beside it as the sister herb of remembrance, tied again and again to memory, the head, and alertness. Together, these plants formed a sensory language for attention before anyone had modern terms for attention. No scanners, no lab vocabulary, just scent, heat, bitterness, and a mind being gathered back into one place. That ritual mattered because the monk's problem was not abstract health, it was the brutal endurance of attention. At the desk, the demand was simple and unforgiving. Copy the line, keep the spelling, hold the phrase in memory long enough to carry it from the page in front of you to the page under your hand, then do it again for hours. This was not romantic labor. It was pressure. A monk in the scriptorium was preserving scripture, sermons, commentaries, rules, chants, and medical texts with a human body as the machine. His eyes scanned, his lips moved, his hand followed. One skipped word could travel into the future farther than the man who made the mistake. So the work trained memory because it had to. Before the page, there were small acts around the body. Fresh sage leaves might be held, crushed or smelled. A simple dawn infusion could warm the hands and throat before recitation. Dried bundles sat near the desk or infirmary. In wider care, sage appeared in herbal preparations, rinses, and recorded remedies as part of learned household and monastery practice. Here is the important part. The brothers did not prove sage sharpened the brain. They inherited a tradition that made attention physical. The scent marked the beginning of work. The warm cup slowed the morning. The repeated act told the mind, now we gather, now we listen, now we do not drift. Not magic, not laboratory science, a ritual of focus. And in a world where memory carried books before printing could flood the room, that mattered. So if the practice was useful, memorable, and woven into learned medicine, why did its reputation collapse? The collapse did not happen because sage vanished. It happened because the rules of proof changed. Modern pharmacy rose by taking plants apart. A leaf became a molecule. A remedy became an isolated compound. A household practice became a standardized dose, tested in controlled trials, and placed behind professional authority. That system did real good. It made medicine cleaner, safer, more measurable. If a patient needed a precise amount of a powerful compound, a garden leaf was not enough. But here is where sage lost status. A leaf in a monastery bed is difficult to standardize. One plant varies by soil, season, drying, storage, and preparation. It is hard to patent, hard to own, hard to turn into a product that only one institution can sell, not useless, not invisible, simply inconvenient. So sage survived where the new system did not need to take it seriously in kitchens. It stayed with roasted meats, stuffing, butter, winter meals, and holiday tables. People kept using it, but the setting changed its meaning. Once it moved from the infirmary shelf to the spice jar, familiarity did the rest. The old seriousness faded. Then came the credibility problem. Herbal sellers made claims too large, too neat, too easy to mock. And once some claims sounded exaggerated, many older uses were dismissed together, even the ones that deserved careful study. So sage was not forgotten, it was demoted. But the story did not end in the kitchen, because modern laboratories eventually began asking a question the monks could never have phrased. What happens when you give sage back to memory, not as folklore, but as a test? Modern researchers looked at common sage, Salvia officinalis, and also Spanish sage. They studied extracts in controlled settings, then watched for short-term changes in memory, attention, alertness, and mood. Here is what made it interesting. Some results suggested that sage may influence an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. In plain terms, that enzyme helps break down acetylcholine, a brain chemical involved in attention and memory. If certain compounds in sage slow that breakdown, even briefly, the signal may last longer. Not magic, chemistry. And sage is not a simple leaf. It carries rosmarinic acid, carnosic acid, flavonoids, tannins, and aromatic oils, different species, different preparations, different strengths. That is exactly why researchers became interested, and exactly why the subject is easy to exaggerate, because promising does not mean proven cure. A culinary leaf is not the same as a concentrated essential oil. A simple infusion is not the same as a standardized extract. Dose matters. Species matters. Safety matters. But the old question had returned through a modern door. The monks saw a herb of remembrance. The laboratory saw pathways, compounds, and measurable effects. And that is where the forgotten herb becomes something larger than a health trend. So the real loss was never just sage. It was the kind of life that made sage matter. A monk did not take a leaf and expect instant brilliance. He entered a rhythm: garden, chapel, desk, meal, silence. The herb belonged to that rhythm, the way a bell belonged to prayer. Modern focus culture sells the opposite: faster mornings, sharper pills, stronger stimulation, a measurable result by lunch. But monastic focus was built, not forced. That is why the old practice became easy to dismiss. Ordinary things do not look powerful in a culture trained to respect speed, extraction, and products. Not rare, not dramatic, simply patient. So no, the world did not forget sage. It forgot the frame that made sage serious. Ancient physicians gave it a place in care. Monks planted it beside study and prayer. Medieval writers tied it to the head, the senses, and memory. Scribes used it inside a wider discipline of silence, rhythm, and attention. Then modern life kept the leaf, but stripped away the system. That is the answer. Sage stayed on the shelf, hidden by being ordinary. If this archive matters to you, save this video and comment with the herb or monastic practice we should investigate next. Thank you for watching.